So what I would like to do today, we can maybe start with the first slide. What I'd like to do today is pick up on a couple of threads from the last two sermons. If you take your mind back, a couple of weeks ago, Pastor John was speaking, and last week, Pastor Vita was speaking, and I just want to sort of pick up on some threads there. So as you recall, a couple of weeks ago, Pastor John was talking about community, and he's talking about Paul, but particularly that thing about discerning the body, right? This idea that how important it is to recognize those around us who are part of the community of Christ. And then last week, important takeaway from what Pastor Vita was talking about is when it comes to being a follower of Jesus, there's nothing that Jesus does that we see in his ministry that we aren't also called to do, okay? But how I'd like to frame that today is through this idea of the community of the Son of Man. Because as we'll see, the Son of Man title that is used of Jesus is very important. It's very important for both those things. There's a community aspect to it, as we will see, but also that aspect that as the Son of Man, that's what Jesus calls us to follow him as this Son of Man figure. Okay, so let's move to the next. One thing you'll probably know, maybe you've noticed this as you've read, all four Gospels, but particularly the first three Gospels, which we call the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is that the title or the term that Jesus prefers all the time when he's referring to himself is Son of Man. He doesn't call himself Messiah. He doesn't call himself Son of God. He doesn't deny those labels when they're placed on him, and those are accurate descriptions of Jesus, and certainly the gospel writers present him that way as Messiah and Son of God. But when it comes to Jesus talking about himself, the term he always goes to is Son of Man. A good way to illustrate this is, and we'll look primarily at Matthew today, because Matthew kind of brings together these ideas of community and who Jesus is and kingdom ideas very well. You've got this very important scene that's at the very center of the gospel narrative, okay? And this is true of all three synoptic gospels, where Jesus, he's on a bit of a retreat with his disciples. And in the context of that, he asks them this important question: who do people say that the Son of Man is? Okay. And they give a variety of responses to that question. And then he asks them more pointedly, who do you say that I am? And Peter gives this statement, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Okay. But what's interesting here, and again, another thing to keep in mind is those three Gospels we just mentioned, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called the Synoptic Gospels because they have so much in common. But we don't want to miss out on the fact that they're also very different. And this passage, the way that Matthew edits this particular scene is very important, okay? That's one thing as you're reading through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, be very attentive to how each of these gospel writers presents things, how they edit these separate scenes. Because one thing to keep in mind is these are our first theologians interpreting Jesus for us. Keep in mind the early titles that are given to these gospels is what? The gospel or the good news according to Matthew or Mark or Luke, because they are used by the Holy Spirit to give us a very important interpretation, a very important theological description of who Jesus is and what his ministry looks like. What Matthew does, which is unique to Matthew, is Jesus, in a sense, already the way he frames the question gives the answer, right? Who do people say that the Son of Man is? Peter responds with these two other titles. What Matthew, and only Matthew does this, Matthew uses this scene to showcase the three most important titles used of Jesus. But again, the one that Jesus himself gives priority to, at least in terms of his own ministry, is Son of Man. And so let's explore why Jesus does that and how this relates to us, okay? How this relates to this whole idea of being a community, a messianic community who follows Jesus. Yeah, so who is this Son of Man? Let's look a little bit at this term, Son of Man. So there's two accents, you could say, that we come across when we see this language in the Bible. On the one hand, it draws attention to humanity and weakness, in our vulnerability, in our mortality, okay? You know, it goes all the way back to the creation narrative, where when God's first making humans, what does he make them of? The earth, right? The soil, the ground. And we have this picture in first part of Genesis 2 of God like a potter forming Adam, or the human, from the earth, okay? And even think of our word human. It's very much related to humus, right? Soil, earth, that kind of thing, right? And it's also very much related to our word humility, okay? That idea of, humility is very much about, as we've already noted, recognizing our weakness, recognizing our vulnerability, and recognizing, therefore, our need of God, okay? But that's part of what Jesus, and so oftentimes, a popular understanding of Son of Man is that it speaks of Jesus in terms of his humanness and his humanity. That, it shows us that he is God, but he's God, incarnate. He takes on flesh. He takes on all those aspects that go with our humanity. But if we only stop there, we would miss a very important part of it, because it's clear that when Jesus uses this language of Son of Man, he's also echoing a very important passage from the Old Testament, and that is Daniel 7, where we are introduced to this Son of Man figure, okay? And, it's interesting, this passage here in Matthew is echoed a little bit later in Matthew 26, when at the trial of Jesus before the high priest point blank asks him, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God?" And how does Jesus respond? By quoting Daniel 7, "You will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds." So even there, even though he owns those titles, Messiah, Son of God, he nonetheless prefers to shift things to Son of Man language. But what's important about Daniel 7 is Daniel 7 draws attention to Son of Man as not just what? Weakness, vulnerability, mortality, but also Son of Man as what? Rule and authority. Okay, so let's look at this passage. Again, just say to you what I say to my students all the time. The Bible can be very daunting. The Bible can be very intimidating, because it is this library of 66 books. It's very complex. It's very sophisticated. It's very difficult to read. What I always say to my students is you can make your understanding of the Bible much easier if you recognize that there are passages that you do yourself a big favor if you get to know them well. And oftentimes the New Testament itself gives us a clue as to what are the Old Testament passages that you really need to know well. And that kind of narrows things a bit for us. It makes it much more manageable. And Daniel 7 would be one of those passages. So I would encourage you, get to know Daniel 7 well. Because we can't understand Jesus without understanding Daniel 7. We can't understand the Gospels and what the Gospel writers are seeking to do. Book of Revelation, the book of Revelation is constantly echoing back to the book of Daniel, and particularly Daniel 7. Okay, so here's a good example of a passage then from the Old Testament that we would want to know well. But note what is said here. This is Daniel writing, "As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven," and that's what Jesus had quoted to the high priest. "And he came to the Ancient of Days," this description of God the Father, "and was presented before him." And note this, "To him was given authority, glory, and rule, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His rule is an everlasting rule that shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall never be destroyed. Okay. When Jesus uses Son of Man language for himself, he is obviously drawing attention to his own humanity and his participation in our life. Okay. But at the same time, he is very clearly referencing this passage. He is this one to whom God the Father has given authority, glory, and rule. And moreover, his rule is going to be an everlasting rule. And this is what gets the high priest so upset at the trial of Jesus and why he tears his garments and says, we've heard enough. This guy's guilty of blasphemy, okay? And why Jesus ends up on the cross, okay? Because the high priest gets what's going on there. Jesus is making this great claim for himself that he is the one to whom God has given everlasting rule, okay? But let's put this in a larger context. So if we look, we won't take time to read the entire of chapter 7. But again, read Daniel 7. But how that chapter begins is, again, Daniel in a vision sees what? These 4 great beasts coming up out of the sea. And what do those beasts represent? Those beasts represent human rule, but not done in a manner that God would want. Okay? And therefore it becomes bestial. And why is it described? Why is it so often in the Bible? Think of the book of Revelation with the beast. That's where, again, here's where John in the book of Revelation is echoing Daniel. When you've got the beast. Okay. And why? And he's talking obviously about, in his immediate context, he's talking about the Roman Empire. Why is the Roman Empire, why is that kind of rule described as bestial? Okay. And it's because it's characterized, when humans rule in a way that does not image God, which does not reflect the character and nature of God, it's not human, it's bestial. And that's why you think of the beasts, they're predatory beasts. Because it's all about destruction, it's all about ravaging, it's all about negativity. And you have that very strong critique throughout the Bible of human rule. But it's human rule gone badly. Okay. And, even before this in Daniel 7, you've got, again, this interesting vision of Nebuchadnezzar, this Babylonian king, where he's what? He's the epitome of arrogance and pride. He's boasting about his achievements. And what does God do? God brings him down, and you have in this vision, in this 7-year period, he becomes like an animal. He becomes like a beast, okay? Because what is God saying to him? Pride and arrogance and boastfulness has nothing to do with how I rule the world. And therefore, you, as a puny human, where do you get off thinking you can be prideful and arrogant and boastful? So if you're not going to act like a human, become a beast, okay? And that's what's behind this critique you find throughout the Bible, because more often than not, what we see throughout human history are examples of kingdoms and empires and leaders with power abusing power and authority, right? And when that begins to happen, you are no longer human according to God's definition of things. You are lower than that. You are now acting in ways that are inconsistent with what it means to be somebody created in the image of God. And you're misusing the authority that God gives to his creatures. But this is where the Son of Man comes in, because the Son of Man in Daniel 7 is the corrective to this. These 4 beasts come out of the water and they wreak havoc over the earth. Their rule just leaves misery and pain in its wake. But what's the remedy? What's the corrective? Is this Son of Man. This one who is then going to be what? Truly human and exercise rule in the way that God always intended for humans to rule. Okay? And that's where Jesus comes in. And that's why Jesus is drawn to this language of Son of Man. Look at me, Jesus is saying, and I will show you what human life is supposed to look like. Look at how I exercise power and authority, and you will see how power and authority is to be exercised. Next slide, please. Because again, this goes all the way back to God's purposes. And again, we've many times we've already looked at Genesis 1:26 to 27. But here again, just to remind ourselves, then God said, let us make Adam. And keep in mind, Adam here, we're not referring to the man Adam at this point. God creates because the word Adam just simply means human, right? It's not until chapter 2 that you have the sexual difference coming into play, when God draws the woman out of the human, and then you have the male and female. Here, it's just simply, let us make the human in our image, in our likeness, and let them, and note the them there, the plural, let them have rule. So there you got the language of rule over the rest of creation. And so God created the human, or created Adam, in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Okay. But here again, he makes the human, and again, from the earth, he makes the human, but he dignifies the human. He gives the human rule over the rest of creation. Psalm 8 basically gives us a commentary on this. Note what the psalmist writes here. What are humans that you are mindful of them? Again, after all, we are just earth, right? We are just soil. Why are you mindful of us? And the sons of Adam, and again, this is meant in a generic kind of way, male and female, that you care for them. You made them a little lower than God, and note this language, crowned them with glory and majesty. You've given them rule over the works of your hands. You've put all things under their feet. So here we have the blueprint in Genesis 1 and in Psalm 8 of God's intentions for humanity. He wants humans to rule over his creation. But again, he wants them to rule over his creation in a way that images his character, his nature, his values, right? And that's why the minute we step outside of that purpose, the minute this devolves into pridefulness and arrogance and self-serving behavior, we're no longer human as far as the Bible is concerned. We've become something, much lower than that. Okay, we've become bestial in effect. Okay. Next slide, please. And so Jesus comes along, and here again, he shows us what a true human looks like. He shows us what a true king looks like. And what's interesting, again, if you look at the Gospels and you're just going to distill how Jesus exercises rule and authority, how is it? He serves the needs of others. What he's going to say later in Matthew is, the Son of Man came what? Not to be served, but what? To serve. And to give his life as a ransom for other people. That's what defines Jesus's ministry. That's what defines his life. It's not about exercising power for his own benefit. It's not about we never ever see Jesus exercising power or authority to serve himself, to suit his own needs. Think of even in the temptation narrative, at the very beginning, even before his ministry really kicks off, what is Satan trying to do? You're hungry? You got the power. Turn these stones into bread, right? You can do something really showy. You could throw yourself from the pinnacle of the temple, and God's going to send angels to protect you. What a great way to make your debut to the people of Israel. Go to the temple, the very center of Jewish life, and do some dramatic thing, okay? But again, Jesus isn't interested in that kind of thing. Or he's shown all the kingdoms of this world and their glory. And what does Satan say? simply bow down to me and all this is yours. And yet Jesus rejects that, because what would happen if Jesus did that? He becomes a beast. He's no longer that Son of God. He's no longer that true human. He's no longer ruling in a way that would be appropriate for him to do so, okay? Because it's about serving. It's not about pride, okay? And then what else do we see Jesus, how does he then use his power and authority? It's always to bring healing and restoration. And that's why the gospel writers give us so much attention to what? The crippled people he heals, the blind eyes he opens, the lepers he cleanses, so on and so forth. So much of the gospel narrative is taken up with those kinds of stories. But it's all about, these beasts have done so much damage to the world. Someone needs to bring restoration and wholeness. And that's what Jesus is doing in his ministry. And breaking the power of sin and Satan. So again, the two kinds of things that are showcased so often in the Gospels are healings and exorcisms, right? Because Jesus recognizes there's this power, there's this evil power that permeates the present age, that affects us negatively, okay? And how this affects us on this personal level is oftentimes through sin. And again, what's the consummate sin? Pride and arrogance, right? Because it's the very thing that interferes with us moving in this way of true humanity, being the sons and daughters of man that God would want us to be, okay? Think of, Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan's famous line in there, I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. And that shows the perversity of sin, the perversity of evil. I'm going to have it my own way no matter what the cost might be, because my ego, my needs, my desires are all important, okay? That's Satan, okay? And that's what Jesus, it's not surprising that the temptation narrative is right there, right after his baptism. As soon as Jesus receives his anointing as king, the very next thing that happens is he's tempted, because the question becomes, how are you now going to use this kingship authority? How are you going to use this power? Are you going to use it in a way that is reflective of Satan and reflective of sinful human nature, or are you going to use it in a way that reflects the image of God? Okay, so Jesus becomes this model for us, okay? Next slide, please. And so right after this passage, so we're back to Matthew 16. Who do people say that I am, or who do people say that the Son of Man is? You're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God. And then what do we see Jesus doing next? He says to Peter, who's made that great confession, he says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, and Pastor John mentioned this passage not too long ago, the gates of Hades will not stand up against it. And what's Jesus getting at with this metaphor of the gates of Hades? It is basically representative of Satan's rule, what Satan's rule looks like. What you'll find in the Gospels is you not only have the kingdom of God, but Matthew and Luke talk about the kingdom of Satan. Satan seeks to exercise rule. But what is Hades? The place of death. That kind of rule only ends in death, because it has nothing to do with the life of God, right? So if you choose that path, if you want to rule in the way that Satan wants to rule, you can do that, but there's only one end there, and that is Hades, the place of the dead, right? Our job as the church is to what? Rescue. We take the battle right to that place of the dead, and the gates are not going to withstand the onslaught of the church. So Jesus presents a picture here of a very powerful church that is exercising, every time he heals someone, every time Jesus raises somebody from the dead, every time he cleanses a leper, all of those stories, what's he doing? He's breaking down the gates of Hades, right? That's what he's doing. If you're a leper, you're as good as dead. In fact, in the first century Judaism, basically lepers were seen as we would see zombies. They're basically the walking dead. That's how a leper was perceived, because their life, I mean, what happens to corpses? The flesh starts rotting. What's true of a leper? Their flesh is rotting while they're still alive, right? So it was seen as a horrible disease. And so you can think of the leper as, here is Jesus breaking down the gates of Hades to release this person from this condition of death, okay? And that's what we are called to do. That's how we want to exercise power and authority. Again, not in ways where, because again, part of the problem sometimes with kingdom theology is sometimes that's been taught in a lot of churches is what? I'm a king's kid, I should have a BMW. And if you have a BMW, I'm not criticizing you. I've had German cars too, right? But the point is, you hear that so often. This is how the kingdom message is sometimes heard by immature Christians. I'm part of God's kingdom. I'm a child of the kingdom. Therefore, my life should be 5-star, first class, top of the line. And that's not what Jesus is wanting us to do. Jesus is wanting us to, again, you're not here to be served. You are here to serve, okay? And that's what breaking down, we're in the rescue and recovery business. That's what we are to be doing right now in this present age. Because these beasts have done so much havoc in the lives of people that we're surrounded by hurting people. Our job is rescue, recovery, okay? And that's what Jesus is getting at here with this gates of Hades metaphor, okay? Next slide, please. So going back to Son of Man, and why this is important is, again, if you look carefully at Daniel 7, and I don't want you to miss this idea that Son of Man is really very much a collective term. We've already read Daniel 7:14. To him, this individual, Son of Man, was given authority, glory, and rule, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His rule is an everlasting rule that shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall never be destroyed. But note, dropping down a few verses, note Daniel 7:27. This is just a little bit later. And note this: the kingship and rule and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, right? We're now into a corporate understanding of Son of Man. The holy ones of the Most High. Who's that? That's us. That's those of us who are part of this church that Jesus has built. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and every authority shall serve and obey them. So note that the same language that is said about this individual Son of Man is now said about this community of the people of God. And that's what Jesus is trying to encourage his church. But again, Jesus would say, just as every time I teach courses on the kingdom of God, I always tell students, forget everything you've ever learned about kings and kingdoms. Because other than Jesus, we haven't had very many good examples of kings and kingdoms, right? I mean, America started because of what? A rebellion against a king, right? And that kind of thing. So kings oftentimes are not models. And even in ancient Israel, it's interesting when the elders of Israel come to Samuel and they say, we want you to put a king over us. Samuel recognizes that that's a rejection of what? Yahweh's rule over his own people. But God says, okay, well, if they want a king, let them have a king. But then he says, but tell them the ways of the king. And again, another important passage to kind of know, 1 Samuel 8, because Samuel goes on this long kind of rant. You want a king, you're going to get a king, and this is what it's going to look like. He's going to take this, take this, take this. It's all take, 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 take. It's not until we get to Jesus that it's what? Give, 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 right? And that's where, and so if we are going to be part of this people of God, we need to look like that individual Son of Man. In other words, we don't even belong with those holy ones of the Most High if we're all about taking. If that's what our life is about, is just taking as much as we can out of the present, we are not part of that community. Because this community reflects the values of that Son of Man that we are introduced to earlier in chapter 7. Okay, next slide, please. And so this will be our last point. So one thing that Matthew does, because again, one thing, Matthew has a lot to say about, he's the only gospel, for example, that uses the word church. I don't know if you recognize that, but it's only in Matthew. You don't find the language of church in Mark, Luke, or John. It's only in Matthew. Because again, he has this interest in community. Not that they don't, but he very much wants to emphasize that. Also, he has so much more to say about the kingdom, and he parses this idea of kingdom. And so one thing that's interesting, if you look at all the kingdom language you have in Matthew, he develops that much more than any other author of the New Testament, He's very much a theologian of the kingdom, And so he comes up with this concept that's unique to his gospel, and that is the kingdom of the Son of Man. And what is he talking about by that? The present rule of Jesus. Think at the very end of Matthew's gospel, what are Jesus' last words to his disciples? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He's basically saying, I am that Son of Man to whom God has now given this eternal rule. And so he's now seated at the right hand of the Father. Jesus is ruling right now, even though we don't see that necessarily. He is nonetheless ruling. What we are presently living in is the kingdom of the Son of Man. And that kingdom will exist until Jesus returns at the end of history. But he's presently ruling. And he's presently ruling as the Son of Man. And we need to be that people of God who are what? Increasing and advancing his rule by exercising his authority in the present age. I mentioned just a moment ago that we are sort of in the rescue and recovery business. One thing that I think we're all probably disturbed this past week by the images coming out of Lahaina in Maui, right? I was, several years ago, I spent a week in Maui, and I really got to like Lahaina, I mean, Lahaina's, so I was really kind of saddened to see all that devastation of that town, because it's such a picturesque place. But one thing I found sort of disturbing this past week was, sometimes in communities like that, you already have a certain kind of antipathy of the residents towards tourists, right? So they have this kind of love-hate relationship with tourists because they recognize they kind of need tourists for the economy, but at the same time they kind of hate tourists, right? That's true of a lot of those kind of vacation places. But this particularly reached a head this past week when you had, at least what I heard on the news, you had residents complaining because what? Tourists are snorkeling when they're still taking bodies out of the water. And tourists are lying on the beach when just 2 blocks away, first responders and other residents are trying to find dead bodies, right? And again, the reason why I don't like escapist eschatologies, as I mentioned before, is it turns us into tourists in this present age. And that is not our role. Our role is we are very much, even though we are not of the world, we are in the world. And what that means is we are very much resident in this present age. Non-Christians can afford to be tourists. They can just think in terms of just enjoy life. We're only here once, might as well have as much fun as possible. If you're not a Christian, that's maybe your attitude. We can't afford to have that attitude. Our attitude is we can't be people who are enjoying life on the beach or life snorkeling when there's recovery that needs to be done, when there are people that need to be rescued, right? And that's how we live as the people of God within this kingdom of the Son of Man. Let's pray.